growled one, in an angry tone. "The hawks are upon us, and we must leave this brave buck to take care of himself. Curse him! Who'd have thought of Hugh Badger's quitting his bed to night? Respect for his late master might have kept him quiet the night before the funeral. But look out, lad. Dost see 'em?" "Ay, thanks to old Oliver, yonder they are," returned the other. "One, two, three, and a muzzle bowser to boot. There's Hugh at the lead on 'em. Shall we stand and show fight? I've half a mind for it." "No, no," replied the first speaker. "That will never do, Rob. No fighting. Why run the risk of being grabbed for a haunch of venison? Had Luke Bradley or Jack Palmer been with us, it might have been another affair. As it is, it won't pay. Besides, we have that to do at the hall to-morrow night, that may make men of us for the rest of our natural lives. We've pledged ourselves to Jack Palmer, and we can't be off in honour. It won't do to be snabbed in the nick of it. So let's make for the prad in the lane. Keep in the shade as much as you can. Come along, my hearty." And away the two worthies scampered down the hillside. "Shall I follow?" thought Luke, "and run the risk of falling into the keeper's hand, just at this crisis too? No. But if I am found here, I shall be taken for one of the gang. Something must be done. Ah, devil take them, here they are already." Further time was not allowed him for reflection. A hoarse baying was heard, followed by a loud cry from the keepers. The dog had scented out the game, and, as secrecy was no longer necessary, his muzzle had been removed. To rush forth now was certain betrayal. To remain was almost equally assured detection, and, doubting whether he should obtain credence if he delivered himself over in that garb, and armed, Luke at once rejected the idea. Then it flashed across his recollection that his gun had remained unloaded, and he applied himself eagerly to repair this negligence, when he heard the dog in full cry, making swiftly in his direction. He threw himself upon the ground where the fern was thickest, but this seemed insufficient to baffle the sagacity of the hound. The animal had got his scent, and was baying close at hand. The keepers were drawing nigh. Luke gave himself up for lost. The dog, however, stopped where the two poachers had halted, and was there completely at fault. Snuffing the ground, he bayed, wheeled around, and then set off with renewed barking upon their track. Hugh Badger and his comrades loitered an instant in the same place, looked warily around, and then, as Luke conjectured, followed the course taken by the hound. Swift as thought, Luke rose, and keeping as much as possible under the cover of the trees, started in a cross line for the lane. Rapid as was his flight, it was not without a witness. One of the keeper's assistants, who had lagged behind, gave the view halloo in a loud voice. Luke pressed forward with redoubled energy, endeavouring to gain the shelter of the plantation, and this he could readily have accomplished had no impediment been in his way. But his rage and vexation were boundless when he heard the keeper's cry echoed by shouts immediately below him, and the tongue of the hound resounding in the hollow. He turned sharply round, steering a middle course, and still aiming at the fence. It was evident, from the cheers of his pursuers, that he was in full view, and he heard them encouraging and directing the dog. Luke had gained the park railings, along which he rushed, in the vain quest of some practicable point of egress, for the fence was higher in this part of the park than elsewhere, owing to the inequality of the ground. He had cast away his gun as useless, but even without that encumbrance, he dared not hazard the delay of climbing the palings. At this juncture, a deep breathing was heard close behind him. He threw a glance over his shoulder. Within a few yards was the ferocious bloodhound, with whose savage nature Luke was well acquainted. The breed, some of which he had already seen, having been maintained at the hall ever since the days of grim old Sir Ranulph. The eyes of the hound were glaring, blood red. His tongue was hanging out, and a row of keen white fangs was displayed like the teeth of a shark. There was a growl, a leap, and the dog was close upon him. Luke's courage was doubled, but his heart failed him as he heard the roar of the remorseless brute, and felt that he could not avoid an encounter with the animal. His resolution was instantly taken. He stopped short with such suddenness that the dog, when in the act of springing, flew past him with great violence, and the time, momentary as it was, occupied by the animal in recovering himself, enabled Luke to drop on his knee, and to place one arm, like a buckler, before his face, while he held the other in readiness to grapple his adversary. Uttering a fierce yell, the hound returned to the charge, darting at Luke, who received the assault without flinching, and in spite of a severe laceration of the arm, he seized his foe by the throat, and hurling him upon the ground, jumped with all his force upon his belly. There was a yell of agony. The contest was ended, and Luke was at liberty to pursue his flight unmolested. Brief as had been the interval required for this combat, it had been sufficient to bring the pursuers within sight of the fugitive. Hugh Badger, who from the acclivity had witnessed the fate of his favourite, with a loud oath discharged the contents of his gun at the head of its destroyer. It was fortunate for Luke that at this instant he stumbled over the root of a tree. The shot rattled in the leaves as he fell, and the keeper, concluding that he had at least winged his bird, descended more leisurely towards him. As he lay upon the ground, Luke felt that he was wounded, whether by the teeth of the dog, from a stray shot, or from bruises inflicted by the fall, he could not determine. But, smarting with pain, he resolved to wreak his vengeance upon the first person who approached him. He vowed not to be taken with life, to strangle any who should lay hands upon him, and at that moment he felt a pressure at his breast. It was the dead hand of his mother. Luke shuddered. The fire of revenge was quenched. He mentally cancelled his rash oath, yet he could not bring himself to surrender at discretion, and without further effort. The keeper and his assistants were approaching the spot where he lay, and searching for his body. Hugh Badger was foremost, and within a yard of him. "Confound the rascal!" cried Hugh. "He's not half killed. He seems to breathe." The words were scarcely out of his mouth ere the speaker was dashed backwards, and lay sprawling upon the sod. Suddenly and unexpectedly, as an Indian chief might rush upon his foes, Luke arose, dashing himself with great violence against Hugh, who happened to stand in his way, and before the startled assistants, who were either too much taken by surprise, or unwilling to draw the trigger, could in any way lay hands upon him, exerting all the remarkable activity which he possessed, he caught hold of a projecting branch of a tree, and swung himself at a single bound fairly over the paling. Hugh Badger was shortly on his legs, swearing lustily at his defeat, directing his men to skirt alongside the fence, and make for a particular part of the plantation which he named, and snatching a loaded fowling piece from one of them, he clambered over the pales, and guided by the crashing branches, and other sounds conveyed to his quick ear, he was speedily upon Luke's track. The plantation through which the chase now took place was not, as might be supposed, a continuation of the ring fence which Luke had originally crossed on his entrance into the park, though girded by the same line of paling, but, in reality, a close pheasant preserve, occupying the banks of a ravine, which, after a deep and tortuous course, terminated it in the declivity heretofore described as forming the park boundary. Luke plunged into the heart of this defile, fighting his way onwards in the direction of the brook. His progress was impeded by a thick undergrowth of briar and other matted vegetation, as well as by the entanglements thrown in his way by the taller bushes of thorn and hazel, the entwined and elastic branches of which, in their recoil, galled and fretted him, by inflicting smart blows on his face and hands. This was a hardship he usually little regarded, but, upon the present occasion, it had the effect, by irritating his temper, of increasing the thirst of vengeance raging in his bosom. Through the depths of the ravine welled the shadow stream before alluded to, and Hugh Badger had no sooner reached its sedgy margin than he lost all trace of the fugitive. He looked cautiously round, listened intently, and inclined his ear to catch the faintest echo. All was still. Not a branch shook, not a leaf rustled. Hugh looked aghast. He had made sure of getting a glimpse, and perhaps a stray shot at the poaching rascal, as he termed him, in the open space which he was sure the fellow was aiming to reach, and now, all at once, he had disappeared like a will-o'-the-wisp or a boggart of the clough. However, he could not be far off, and Hugh endeavoured to obtain some clue to guide him in his quest. He was not long in detecting recent marks deeply indented in the mud on the opposite bank. Hugh leapt thither at once. further on,